I want to take the opportunity to say thank you to many of you who have committed to partnering with us this week in Vacation Bible School. As of right now, there are around 200 boys and girls that are registered to join us, and we always have a lot that come tonight and tomorrow and register. There have been a lot of you who have been here this week working tirelessly to decorate your rooms and hallways, getting ready for this. And throughout our country specifically, but even closer knit than that, throughout the Southern Baptist Convention, Vacation Bible School is the largest evangelistic tool that is used around our convention. More boys and girls will come to know Christ as the efforts of churches throughout our nation this week. And I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to partner with this. When I started looking at the numbers of time that we're able to spend with our children this week, on average, if children come to our kickoff and come to all of the Vacation Bible School services during this week, they will spend roughly 18 to 19 hours in our care. That's about 18 to 19 hours of discipleship, of intentional Bible that we will be able to pour into those children through songs, through crafts, through Bible story, through mission time, through all of those different avenues. And if you really think about it, 18 or 19 hours, that's about the same amount of time that we have in a 3-month span with our children if they come regularly, sorry about that, if they come to church like we would like for them to be here. My third time around, the lips have stopped working evidently. But I want you to understand the important role that you play this week in discipling our children and helping them know the love of Christ. We as a church, as a staff, we thank you for your commitment and for what you will be doing this week. As we get started today, the theme verse for Vacation Bible School this year is John chapter 20, verse 31. We'll get to that verse in just a minute. But throughout this week, our children will be going on 5 encounters with God, and we're going to talk about some of those encounters a little bit today. We're going to encounter Jesus. We're going to have this amazing encounter with Jesus. But before we get there, I want to tell you a story of a young boy who his dad was a pastor, or is a pastor. This dad was preaching on a Sunday morning about Jonah and the whale. And at the end of the sermon, and he and his son, they're in the car together on the way home, and the son asked his dad, "So, Dad, how is it that a fish can swallow a man, and the man can live in his belly for 3 days, and then the fish spit him out on dry land and him still be alive? How is that even possible?" And the dad, being the theologian that he was, he looks down to his son and he says, "Well, God created the entire universe with the sound of his voice. And after he created the universe with the sound of his voice, he created all of the land that we see on the earth. He created that with the sound of his voice. And then he created all of the animals that we have on the earth. And he created all of those animals with the sound of his voice. And then he created all of the birds and all of the sea creatures with the sound of his voice. And then he created man, not out of the sound of his voice, but out of forming him from the dust of the earth that he had already created. And then he breathed life into his nostrils to give him life." And Dad said, "If God can do all of those things, then I believe he could create a fish big enough to be able to swallow a man." And the son just looks back up at his dad and says, "Well, Dad, if you're going to bring God into this, that changes everything." And the reality is, when we bring God into the mix, it changes everything. God changes our perspective on everything that we go through in life. And today in John chapter 20, we're going to take a look at a passage which many people consider this to be the bookend or the closing of the parentheses, so to speak, in John's gospel. It doesn't end John's gospel. It goes on to chapter 21. But the 2 verses that we're going to focus on today are the exclamation point, so to speak, that here's the gospel throughout the book of John, and here's the end of that message. John writes his gospel a little bit differently than the other gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark, being the oldest, writes his gospel somewhere around 50 AD, about 20 years or so after Jesus has died. And in his writing, his audience, his purpose in writing is different than John's. About 10 or so years later, maybe 15, Matthew and Luke write their gospel letters or their gospel books, and they evidently use some of Mark's writing as a model for different things that they decide to include, different things they decide not to include. And when you look at those three Gospels, scholars call those the synoptic Gospels. And they're different. The tone and tenor of those Gospels, it's different than the Gospel of John. John writes his Gospel about 20 or 30 years after Matthew, Mark, Luke have been written. And his audience is a little bit different. The church has gone through some different changes, this being the second generation after Jesus' death. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their audience is written to those who are primarily in that first generation from the time of Jesus' death. John's is that second generation. So there's been some change in focus of the church. There's been some change in things of what the church says. These are the things that we're going to stand on, and they're going to be important. And one of those specifically is the fact that Jesus is God, that he is deity, that he is the Son of God. It's one of the major purposes in John writing his gospel when he did. At that point in time in the early church, one of the main new things that had come about was the study of Gnosticism, the study of where knowledge is everything. Knowledge and everything can be found in knowledge. And a part of that was that Christianity started to not quite understand that Jesus was God. And so John took the opportunity to address this major issue that the church was facing. And he does that, and throughout his whole gospel, he writes all of the different things that he does. He concludes the gospel message of his gospel in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, when he says this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, and this is the focal verse, this is the theme verse for Vacation Bible School this week. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. As John writes these words, there are some things that he is intentional to point out. The first of which is that there are some things that John decides to not include in his writing. As the author, he's able to choose what he wants to write about Jesus and what he doesn't want to write about Jesus. He has that artistic liberty, so to speak. And he admits there are some things that Jesus is, as we see these signs of Jesus, he says there are some things that Jesus did that we don't see. There are some things that Jesus performed, there are miracles that he performed that John chose not to write about. The other Gospels, if you were to look at a harmony of these Gospels, you look at how all of them lay out with each other. Different Gospels record different things. Some of them record the same things. But John specifically says there are things that I didn't choose to write about in this book. Honestly, I believe that of all the things that Jesus did, there are many, many, many things that we don't see in the Scriptures. Because the Scriptures aren't enough to be able to tell us everything that Jesus did. And so what the gospel writers did, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is they chose the specific things to write about which would help them accomplish their purpose in their writing. John is specifically, like we said, his purpose is to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. And so in doing so, he chooses to leave out some signs, but then there are some written signs that he does choose to point out. Now, it's very interesting to me that a lot of times when you look at the Gospels, there are primarily two different words that we see for miracles and signs. The one that we see majority of the time is the word dunamin, where we get the word dunamis, power. It's where we get the word dynamite, okay? And that word, the meaning of that word, that miracle, is it is a miracle that is the manifestation of great power. Right? And that's the purpose when Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they record those types of miracles, their purpose is to show the power that Jesus has. That was their purpose in writing those. And they chose to use that word, which translates for us miracle. John, nowhere in the Gospel of John do we find the word miracle. He never uses it. The reason he doesn't is because John is writing for a different purpose. John's purpose is to prove not that Jesus was powerful, but to prove that Jesus is God. The word that John uses for signs in the Greek is semeion. It's a marvelous event that manifests in a supernatural act of a divine, acted on by a divine agent to communicate a message. So John uses this word, semeion, to prove the point that Jesus is the Son of God. And so that we never see the word miracle used in John's writing. We do see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We see it throughout the New Testament. But we never see it in the book of John because that's not John's purpose. John's goal isn't to do that. And so what John does is he chooses to write about 7 miracles, and we're going to go over those 7 briefly. And I encourage you, as we go over these, write these down, and I want to challenge you to do something. I want to challenge you this week to spend some time in the Word, which is hopefully something that you do quite frequently. But I want you to do something. As you read through these 7 signs that John writes about, that Jesus performs, these miraculous signs, I want you to read them from the perspective of understanding that John's goal is to prove that Jesus is God. The first of these miracles we find in John chapter 2, verses 3 through 11, and that's the miracle where Jesus turns water into wine. Okay, now Jesus is here at this wedding, and they're out of wine to drink. Now, understand that wine is different than the wine that we have today. Right? Jesus was not a bartender. Right? That wine is drastically different. In those days, the water was unsafe for them to be able to drink, and so they ran out at the end of this party, and Jesus has them bring in 6 cisterns of water that was unsafe to drink, and as they pour the water out of the cisterns, it's wine. And Jesus meets that physical need for those individuals. And that's one of the things that you'll find about all of these 7 miracles is that Jesus is meeting a specific need of an individual or a group of people. And Jesus specifically meets this need at this wedding, just like he meets our need. So Jesus turning the water into wine, that's the first sign. The second sign is in John chapter 4, verse 46 through 54, where Jesus heals the official's son. Jesus, again, this son is there, and Jesus heals him, even at a distance. He's not even literally with this son when he heals him. And Jesus performs this sign to prove his divinity, to prove that I am God. And that's the reason that John records that sign. The third sign is in John chapter 5, verses 2 through 9, where Jesus heals the crippled man by the pool of Bethesda. Now, this crippled man had been there. The angels would come. They would stir the water at the pool, and the first person that was able to get in the water was the person who would be healed. Well, this man being crippled, being not able to get into the pool, he just stayed there until hoping that somebody would put him in the pool. And Jesus says, you don't need this pool. I'm here. And Jesus uses this opportunity to meet this need of this man, to miraculously heal him, and to use this as a sign that he is the Son of God. Number 4, you find it in John chapter 6, verses 5 through 14. This is one that we quite frequently teach in children's ministry, and we all need to be reminded of it. It's where Jesus feeds the 5,000. 5,000 men we know of, probably a crowd of about 12 to 13,000. They're hungry. They're tired. The disciples come to Jesus, and Jesus, this big crowd is here. We've got to send them off to get some food. And Jesus has something that's funny. You feed them. Are you kidding me? I think one of the things that's even more funny is Jesus, a little bit later on in the story, says, have them sit down in the grass. How difficult do you think that would have been? I think that would have been a miracle in and of itself, for them to tell 12,000 people to sit down in the grass. Jesus was specific in those instructions. And he takes this lunch of this little guy and 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. And he's able to feed this large crowd with this. And something that's very interesting, if you read through that passage at the end, they have baskets of food left over. And they're specific, it's specific to mention the number of baskets that's left over. There's 12. And I believe the reason why there are 12 baskets left over is because the disciples need to know. There's 12 disciples. They've gathered all of these things. There's 12 baskets left over. Specific in John writing that the number 12 there. It's because there are 12 disciples who at some point in time in their life, in just a few minutes and just a couple of verses, they're going to begin to doubt who Jesus is again. And they're going to need another miracle. And so they have these baskets as a way to remember this day that Jesus met that need. So we'll fast forward a couple more verses down to verse number 15. The disciples are now afraid. There's this storm, and Jesus walks on the water to them to meet this need whenever they are afraid, when they are not sure of what's going to happen for them. And Jesus meets that need. He walks on the water to them. Fast forward to John chapter 9. We see that Jesus, John chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, Jesus heals a man who's been blind from birth. There's a discussion between Jesus and those around him, and the discussion is, well, who was it that's responsible for this man being blind? Was it his parents' sin or was it his sin? And Jesus said it was neither. This man was born blind so that he could be used as a sign to prove who I am. And then the last one, another one of those very familiar passages, John chapter 11, verse 3 through 44, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. His friend. Jesus shows here that he has victory over death. All of these miracles show that Jesus has victory over all of these different areas. And the final one is that Jesus has victory over death, that Jesus has power over death. Jesus uses all of these examples, all of these signs to prove who he is. And these are the 7 miracles that John chooses to include in his gospel. And like we said, his purpose in doing so is intentional. John chose these 7 because he wants his people to understand 2 things. And John tells us what those 2 things are. If we'll follow along, look at verse number 31. But these things are written so that you may believe. These things are written so that you may believe. That word believe is a funny word. My definition of believe is probably different than your definition of believe. I believe something. It's because of the things that go on in my life, and that's the reason why I believe those things. You have different beliefs because of different things that go on in your life. And so we have to solidify what we mean or what we're going to believe in. I've heard a pastor before preach a message, and the title of the message was The Worst Verse. And he uses John 3:16, and I understand what he's saying. And he says the reason that's the worst verse is because of that one word, believe. Because your definition of believe may be different than mine, and my definition of believe may be different than his. Now, I'm not saying there's any verse in the Bible that's bad, but I understand the premise of what he's saying. Based on our belief in Jesus, we have salvation. But there are also times that our belief may be different than what we're supposed to believe in. And that's what John is focusing on. He's trying to get the church to understand that we have to believe, one, that Jesus is the Christ. The first thing that we've got to understand, John says, is that we must believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Christos, the appointed one. In the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 3, we see where sin entered into the world, and because of sin, there was this need for salvation. Because of sin, there was this need for a Savior. Because of Adam and Eve's choice, because of their sin, something had to change. And we see that change there in a conversation between God and Satan on the form of a serpent. And God tells Satan, he makes this statement, that you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. And when he's having this discussion, not a discussion, it's more of God just saying this is what's going to happen. It wasn't a back and forth discussion. When he tells Satan you're going to bruise his heel, that means that you're going to inflict pain, you're going to inflict hardship, you're going to inflict heartache, you're going to bring different things onto them, and it's going to bruise their heel. But in the end, your head will be crushed. And ever since that moment in history, the Israelites were looking for that Savior. Now, they didn't fully understand what that Savior meant. They were looking more for this political leader. That's who the Israelites, throughout their history, if you study all of this stuff, that's what they were looking for. If you study the whole Old Testament, that's ultimately, they were looking for salvation, but they didn't understand fully what the Messiah was going to be. They didn't understand fully who the Messiah was going to be. John, in chapter 1, verse 41, as he's having a discussion with the early disciples, all 12 weren't disciples yet, there's just the first few that are there with him. And in verse 41, as they're having this discussion, they make this statement, we have found the Messiah, which means Christ, John 1:41. They have found this Messiah. They have found the Christos. They have found this man that throughout the whole Old Testament they were looking for. They were searching for him, waiting for him. That's the reason at Christmas we talk about the Magi, the wise men. They were looking for the star all the way through the whole Old Testament. They'd been looking for it. It wasn't like it just popped up and these wise men said, hey, there's a star. Let's go find Jesus. No, they were searching for this thing. They've been looking for him throughout the Old Testament. And the disciples say, we have found the Christ. We have found the Messiah. John, as he's writing about this in backstory, he understands this is that moment when the disciples begin to understand this is him. This is who we've come. This is who's come for us. This is who Jesus is. After we see that Jesus is the Christ, the next thing, so John establishes that. The first thing we've got to understand is that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. He is the appointed one. Then we see that you believe in Jesus, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Again, this is one of the main purposes behind this book, is to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. There are many religions out there that don't understand this. There are many religions out there that don't believe this. They believe that Jesus was a man that lived a life, that he died, that he even died on the cross, but they don't believe that he was the Son of God. And that's one of those distinguishing factors. The total thesis of the Gospel of John is the belief in the Son who came from the Father. So as you look at this, it's interesting. We're going to backtrack a little bit. I want you to go up with me to verse 26. Jesus has, as we've established, Jesus has died. He's resurrected. He's now come to visit with his disciples, and there's one disciple that doesn't get it. There's one disciple that is struggling with this. He has doubt. He's Thomas. That's the reason we call him Doubting Thomas. Look at verse 26. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, so he has this conversation and he tells all the disciples, "Peace be to you." And then he turns to Thomas, who has already admitted that he doesn't believe this. He turns to Thomas and he says, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it here in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." When we look at Thomas, Thomas is in this situation where he's not sure. He's uncertain. And Jesus was able to meet that need for Thomas. But Jesus says for Thomas, he says, "Do you believe because you see?" But he says, "Truly blessed are those who believe without seeing." Although we can't have a conversation with Jesus physically, although we can't see him physically face to face, and we can't touch him with our hands and share a meal with him the way that the disciples did, we still need this faith, just like Thomas had. But our faith is different. Our faith is without seeing. Our faith, and that's the reason Jesus says that blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Verse 31, here's why we believe. That by believing, you may have life in his name. After we have this belief in Jesus, we see these signs of Jesus, we have this belief in Jesus, and then finally we see salvation from Jesus. Jesus gave his life so that we could have his life. Jesus gave his life for me so that I could have his life. Jesus' loving life for my hated life. Jesus' pure life for my blemished life. Jesus' perfect life for my sinful life. Jesus took my place as a sinner so that I could take his place as a child of God. And the reality is, all of us need this. The simple fact, when we think about this, that we become a child of God, Jesus takes our place as a sinner. His death is that it replaces our death. So he died the death that I needed to die so that I could live the life that he was already living. But whenever he adopts me into the family, it's just like adoptions. Many of you in this sanctuary have adopted children into your home. There are many families in our church that have adopted, and we even have some that are working towards adoption right now. And it's amazing whenever I sit down in our student ministry and I have conversations with students who have adopted siblings. And I ask those students, I said, so when your younger brother or sister or whoever it is that's adopted in your house, when you guys get things at Christmas because you're biological children, you guys get certain things at Christmas, but the adopted children, they get other gifts that aren't as good as yours, right? And every single one, no, we get the same kind of stuff. Well, so wait a minute. So when you get punished for doing things wrong or doing things bad, you don't get as much of a punishment as the adopted children, right? No, it's all the same. And the point I'm trying to make here is that as an adopted parent, we love our children the same. There's no difference in the adopted children and the biological children. And when we look at this, when we understand this thought that Jesus takes our place on the cross so that we can take his place as a child of God, that means that I get all the benefits of being a child of the King. I get every single thing that Jesus gets. I get it all. I don't deserve any of it, but I get every bit of it. And that's what Jesus does for us, is he looks at us and we understand this thing and we understand this principle because of our belief in him. There's a question that I ask our students, or a statement that I make to our students quite often, and I typically follow that up with a question. The statement is this: the thing that separates Christianity from every other religion in the world is Jesus. The thing that separates Christianity from any and every other world religion is Jesus. There are religions out there that, as we said, Jesus lived a life. They believe that Jesus lived. There's little doubt that Jesus lived. There are some people out there that still think that Jesus, but history has proven to us that Jesus lived. Okay? And so there are many people that believed he lived. There are many people that believe that he was many people believe he lived, which he did. There are many people that believed that he died on the cross, which he did. There are many people that believe that he even did miracles, which he did. But Christianity says that Jesus lived a perfect life. He died a perfect death for me. 3 days later, he rose from the dead, and now he's seated at the right hand of the Father. What we say about Jesus, or what Jesus says about himself in the scriptures, that's what separates Christianity from every other religion. Jesus. It's what he is. It's who he is. It's what he does. And so whenever I make this statement to our students, I usually follow up with this question: who do you say Jesus is? Who do you say he is? Is Jesus your Lord? Is Jesus just this person that you come to church and read about and hopefully study about? Is Jesus this person that you talk about occasionally? Or is he the Lord of your life? Jesus is either the Lord of all of your life or he's not Lord at all. And so we have to determine for ourselves who we say Jesus is. It doesn't change anything for him. He's Jesus. He is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. It doesn't change anything for him, but it changes everything for us. Our view of Jesus changes everything. What is your view of Jesus? Who do you say Jesus is? Is he your Lord? If he's not, today I encourage you to allow him to become your Lord. Is what you've been saying about Jesus, was there a moment in your life when Jesus was the Lord but now he's not? Well, guess what? You have the opportunity to let him be Lord again. Again, he hasn't gone anywhere. It's only us that have gone places.